Hi everyone, I'm Jen Lucas, managing editor of the Knitting Circle, and I want to welcome you to today's live Q&A. It's the very first one that we're doing for the Knitting Circle, and I'm so excited that you are all able to join us. We're going to be doing these live Q&A chats once a month, so be sure to check us out on Facebook and also sign up for our newsletter so that you can get notified when we're going live with our Q&As. Really, this is just a time for us to get together and chat with other knitters and knitting instructors and just really talk about the hobby that we love so much. And so today we're going to be talking with Corrina Ferguson, who is my friend and a designer. And before we get talking with her, there's just one more thing I wanted to mention, which is that today we have a free pattern for you to download, the Chunky Broken Rib Cowl. And so you'll find a link to that in the comments wherever you're watching it. So you can go ahead and download that for free. It's a really cute, easy cowl pattern that you can knit up, honestly, in just one day. So now let's get started and talk with Karina. She's a knitting and crochet designer, an instructor, and a technical editor. And she's here today to talk about knitting and answer all your questions. So go ahead, leave your questions in the chat box or the comments wherever you're watching it, and we'll work through those while we're chatting with Karina. So, hey, Karina, thanks for joining me.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So I thought to start off, maybe you could tell me a little bit about how you got started knitting. And then I also want to know, because I'm always so curious, how did you make the jump from being a knitter to it being your job?
Oh, well, we moved to Florida when my children were little, and I
Mhm.
was super excited because I was going to stop working and be a stay-at-home mom. And then the children had the audacity to go to school.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh my goodness. And it turned out that there was a knitting store like within walking distance of where we had moved here in Florida at the time. And so I took a class actually at the Michaels and learned how to knit because I tried to use the books and was hopeless. And then kind of found my people at the knitting store, which, we can't do that right now. But a lot of those people I talk to still every day, which is really cool. I mean, I've been here for almost 17 years, and some of those people I still talk to every day.
Mhm.
And I met them knitting. And so I did that as my hobby. And then as the boys got into activities, it was great because, you go to basketball practice, you go to Boy Scouts, you go to whatever, and you just take your knitting with you. And then as far as the career thing, I've always kind of been a natural born teacher. I was going to be a teacher when I grew up, and then, life had other plans.
Mhm.
But I started teaching at the yarn store. And then I had to write little patterns for the classes that I taught at the yarn store because, can't just take anybody's pattern and teach a class. And it kind of snowballed from there. And then that, of course, was when there were just a lot more opportunities. And, I was making all these knitting friends online. And then I was a knitting designer. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I guess my story is kind of similar. I did learn to knit from a book. My friends actually had bought me like Learn to Knit in Just One Day booklet that you can find at the craft stores.
I have
And
that one.
oh, is that the one you tried to use? I
I
actually
could do it.
I did learn to knit from it, but it did take me longer than one day. I feel like the knit stitch I got down right away, but purl took me a while to learn how to purl. I feel like now it is a little bit easier. There's a lot more like content online that you can
Oh,
find to help
yeah.
you get started with knitting. Um, but actually, the reason I got into knitting was that this is such a weird reason is that my friends, oh, as you know, I love the Golden Girls and we were super into it. And we did not realize that Sophia was crocheting and not knitting. And so, like, my friends
Oh.
bought me this book as a joke to be like, oh, you could be like Sophia from the Golden Girls, but we didn't even realize the difference between knitting and crochet at that time. So, yeah, I'm always so
That's
curious how
awesome.
people get started. And yeah, same as you. Like, I don't know, kind of was like a natural progression from just knitting to designing as well. So one question I have, as people are starting to drop some questions into the chat box, but I'm going to start with another question that I have. I would also like to know about your design process. Like, do you think of the thing? Do you write the whole pattern out and then knit it? Do you design it as you go? Sort of what's your process as you're designing a new thing?
If I was a smarter designer, you know what I'm going to say here, I
Yeah.
would have a complete pattern and then I would knit the thing.
Mhm.
What I tend to do is it kind of depends on what's going on. I don't do a lot of stuff for magazines anymore. They would always tell you what they want. We
Mhm.
want something that fits this theme. Really, for me, it's a lot of I want to knit a sweater. Um, Recently, I did a job where I did a bunch of tech editing, which is making sure the pattern's right for a company. And they're like, "Oh, we'll send you some yarn." And I'm like, "There's this dream sweater that I want to make." But my process is a lot of what does the yarn want to be? Um, I try to take really good notes, and then it's time to actually write the final pattern. And I'm frantically hunting for the notes that I
Mhm.
said that I was going to take. Um, as the years have gone on, I've gotten very, I take a lot of notes in on my computer. So
Mhm.
I'll have files. I try to set up a folder, like a computer folder for each design. And then, I'll put the chart in there and I'll put any notes that I have in there. I'm trying to get in the habit of taking a picture of the yarn label. I'm so bad about
Mhm.
knowing what color I actually used. And sometimes if you go online, the colors are not what you have in your hands. And you're
Right.
like, well, I could have used this one or that. So, but really it's just kind of a, what does the yarn want to be? And I used to have this huge library of knitting books that had stitch patterns in them. I still have it, but I never use it anymore because there's so much online that I end up just browsing through Pinterest or, thinking, oh, I could modify such and such. But it really is kind of a crazy, do we want to look inside Karina's head really kind of process?
Yeah.
Um, but I always tell people to do as I say, not as I do. So when people ask me for designing advice, I'm like, okay, you got to have a place to put the notes. You got to write everything down. You've got to have, just get it all together, keep it in one place, know where you have it so that you're not like me and it's 3 o'clock in the morning and you can't find a yarn label.
Right.
So,
Yeah, I have like this huge stack of yarn labels that just sits on my desk, and it's just when it comes time to write the pattern, it's a matter of digging through my pile of yarn labels. And for a while I was really good. I would staple that yarn label right to my piece of graph paper where I took my notes, but I don't know,
right.
just over the years it's just yeah, I don't know. The yarn labels, that's always, I think for a lot of designers, that's sort of the trickiest part is keeping track of those yarn labels. And I do sort of the same thing where I have a folder for each design. But if I'm doing shawls, I actually do have a tendency to write out the entire pattern, everything first, and then knit from it, and then like write notes of what I'm changing on it as I go. But
That's
I'm
very
so
smart.
yeah, but I feel like I designed so many shawls that, I can, for the most part, for a lot of different shawl shapes, write a whole pattern and like I already know in my head kind of how it's going to look. Like for you, I know you do a lot of sweaters and you do lots of cool different constructions and stuff. So I could see why you would need to take a lot more notes as you go. Um, opposed
Yeah.
to, when I'm just doing like a triangle or something like that. Okay, so I think maybe now we'll go and see what kind of questions we have here in the chat box. So, Robin would like to know, which this is a great question for you, Karina, since you're a sweater designer. How can I avoid an underarm hole when I pick up stitches under the arm of a raglan sweater?
That is a very good question. Actually, do a lot of top-down sweaters and a lot of raglans. And my best tip for that, the easiest thing to do, is to not worry about the holes. 9 times out of 10, when you're doing a raglan sweater and you're picking up for the sleeves, you've already done the body. So you have to attach, and I'm like pointing to my underarm and you can't see it. You have to attach a new piece of yarn, a new length of yarn under the arm. And what I do almost all of the time is I just go back and when I weave in my ends, I just cinch up all those little holes. And you usually get one kind of where it starts and kind of where the pickup ends. You'll get one on each side, but you want your ends woven in very securely. So I suggest just doing that. The other thing that you can do, and it just requires a tiny bit of thinking on your part. You have to remember that you did it. And I've forgotten sometimes, and I go to count my stitches and it's wrong. But you can go ahead and pick up extra stitches. You can pick up from the different places. Sometimes they'll have you pick up where you've bound off under the arm. Sometimes there's live stitches under the arm that you're just putting back on the needles. But there's always that spot between that underarm length and then the actual stitches that kind of come around. And you can pick up extra stitches in those corners and just use like half of a stitch to kind of do that. You just have to remember that when you do your first all the way around for the part of the sleeve is that you need to get rid of those. So you would do a knit two together or a slip slip knit in order to, to get rid of those stitches so that you don't have a couple of extra stitches when you get like to your cuff and then your ribbing doesn't work and then you're like, hey, what did I do? And then you're like, oh, that's what I did. And you can always decrease those away when you get to the bottom and you're like me and you realize you did it. But really, I think the easiest way is just to kind of let that be how it is and use your end to weave it in and to close those up. And I'm a little more careful about it with socks because that's another place that you pick up stitches and you get that little hole. With the socks, I always do an extra pickup because you're trying to have as few ends as possible with your socks. Obviously, you don't want to have a big woven in end on the side. But with the underarms, and I think it kind of gives a little bit of structure there to have a little more with the weaving in of the ends because, that's a place where it can get kind of loosey-goosey under there.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Most of the time, I just use my ends to fix sort of any kind of little hole that I have in my knitting from picking up. So like you said, I definitely use it with like socks. I do pick up an extra stitch or two sometimes if I'm doing the sock. But other than that, like where I tend to get a hole is maybe not even so much the underarm of the sweater, but like when I'm doing like mittens and fingerless mitts and stuff, the thumb, like where the thumb joins, if you're doing like a gusset, same thing. I just always just use the tail that's there to sort of close up whatever little hole that I happen to have. Yeah, and that works great. But yeah, also sometimes picking up those extra stitches and decreasing them away, that helps as well. Okay, let's see. We have a question here from Susan. She's been watching our 14-day Learn to Knit series. Thank you so much for watching that. And if you're wondering what I'm talking about, we have a 14-day Learn to Knit series on the Knitting Circle. So if you're brand new to knitting or you're a beginner and you need to review some topics, you can go check that out. And what Susan is wondering is, she's picking up extra stitches as she adds rows. So I think like more stitches are getting onto the needle as she's working. And it seems to be happening most commonly with the seed and moss stitches. So I think that she's looking for any maybe tips or suggestions on when you're getting extra stitches, especially with seed and moss stitch.
That's easy to do because with a seed or a moss, of course, you're doing in the same row, you're switching back from knit to purl very often. And I think what a lot of people do is their yarn doesn't get all the way to the back or the front, and then you've made another stitch. And if you don't notice that right away, you just kind of keep going. So you just have to be careful about that and make sure that you're actually getting your yarn, in the correct position so that you don't add those extra stitches. Not so much for seed and moss, but just in general, what a lot of people do, especially when they're beginners, and I made a huge mess of it when I was first learning, is that when you go to start a row, you'll wrap the yarn around in such a way that when you come back to it, it looks like another stitch and it doesn't leave a hole in your work. And so you're just like, oh, this is a stitch I need to work. And you go, and then all of a sudden you started with 10 and you have 15, if you're me, and you make something that's more of a trapezoid than a rectangle.
Yeah, same. I was going to say same thing. Most of the time with seed and moss, it's that remembering to bring the needle or the yarn in between the needle and not over. And then, yeah, at the ends of the rows, that's always that for me too. When I first started knitting, I actually still have my very first piece of knitting that I ever made. And it's just like this strip and it's like,
oh yeah. And it goes
it's
like,
important
there's
to
like
remember where you
edges and it's a mess.
I also have my first sock, which could have fit like a 10-foot tall human. It was not for an actual person, but it was a sock. It just wouldn't fit anybody. Let's see here. I saw another question from Susan. Oh, here we go. Susan would also like to know if ponchos are good for beginners.
I think yes.
I think yes too.
I think ponchos would be very good for beginners because part of the thing that's very intimidating about a sweater is the fact that not only do you have to, if you're doing, a pullover, you have to knit some kind of tube for your body or pieces that you can sew into a tube. You
Mhm.
also have to knit tubes for your arms, and there might be collars and there might be buttons. Whereas a poncho is really a great way to learn a variety of techniques. When I'm teaching beginning knitting classes, I always tell people, it's knit and purl, and every single thing else that you do is just some combination of that. If you
Mhm.
can knit and you can purl, we can get you to the rest, because sometimes you're knitting two stitches together, sometimes you're wrapping the yarn in a funky way in order to do the knit or the purl or the smocking or whatever fancy thing you're doing. But when it all boils down to it, it's just knit and purl. And with a poncho, most ponchos will start from the top down. You're going to be learning, some increasing, different, there's lots of different methods of increasing, of course, but basically you're just going to be doing some increasing and then making something that's really wearable and really fun. And ponchos are very forgiving. Whereas, if I
Mhm.
make a sweater that fits a toddler as opposed to myself, we have a problem.
Yeah.
But, with a poncho, as long as you can get it over your neck, we can make the rest of it work.
Yeah. And the other thing too is there's so many different types of poncho constructions. So like
Mm-hmm.
you can even find ones that you just basically knit a gigantic rectangle and
Mm-hmm.
then seam it basically on one side. I did design one of these a long time ago, and it was literally just a rectangle. And this particular one that I'm thinking of that I made had like lace and a little bit more complicated things on it. But you can find definitely beginner patterns where it's just a rectangle, and then you just have to add basically a seam right here, and you've made a poncho. And Karina's done some great videos for the knitting circle on like different ways to seam up your knitting. So we have the video. So you just knit your
There,
rectangle and seam it up.
Yeah, there really are a lot of easy constructions for ponchos. But like I said,
Yeah.
I think it's actually a very good choice. It's a lot of knitting, depending on, how fine your yarn is. But it's something that it's very easy to end up with something wearable and that you can
Mm-hmm.
be super proud of.
Right. I mean, sometimes I'll have people ask, like, oh, if I'm a beginner knitter, can I knit a sweater? And I'm always like, hey, you go for it. Like, I think you should go for it. There actually are a lot of people who just really wanted to knit a sweater, and that's what they did as their first project. But like, that can be intimidating for a lot of people. So, poncho, that's a great way to get, yeah, something totally wearable, but you don't have to worry so much about the fit of it. That's,
Hmm.
that's kind of nice, especially when you're a beginner.
Yes.
Yes. So, okay, let's see. We got some more questions. Allison wants to know, how do I stop my stockinette stitches from curling? That's a very popular problem people have with their knitting.
It is. It is. Stockinette wants to curl.
Mhm.
That's what it likes to do, and it will do it unless you make it not. Um, Depending on what kind of project you have, edgings are going to be your friend. If it's a garter stitch edging or a ribbed edging, and it just kind of depends on the project that it is. You never want to knit a scarf that's all stockinette, because it's always going to curl in on the ends, and then the bottoms are going to flip over to show you the wrong side. You definitely have to have some edging in there. But the other thing, and Jen, we have videos on blocking, right?
Mhm. Yep. Yep.
The
Sure
other
do.
thing that you do, in addition to having some edgings, is you block the work. And
Mhm.
blocking the work makes the stitches behave more like you want them to behave. You basically just stretch them into submission. um, but a combination of blocking and making sure that whatever you have has an edging. If you knit a straight piece of stockinette, it's always going to curl. Even if you block that, it's going to want to go back to curl. And some sweaters and garments will use that as a design feature. I've seen a lot of really cute rolled down collars and sleeve edges
Mhm.
where they took advantage of the fact that stockinette curls. You just have to kind of be aware of that and think about the different edgings that you can add to your work.
Yeah, that's just the nature of stockinette, is that it is going to curl. And again, going back to kind of when we were talking about, oh, when we first learned to knit, one of the first things I made was a scarf, and I just was like, oh, now I know how to knit and purl, and I did it in stockinette, and it looked this wide when I was knitting it, and then then it slowly like became this wide because it curled up on itself. Okay, let's see. We have another question here. You have somebody that would love some tips on neatly sewing up a garment. They say that they've ruined so many knitted garments when putting it when putting them together? It's from Pauline, who's asking this question. She says, I'm 75 years old and have knit for 66 years after being taught by my grandmother. That's awesome.
That
So
is awesome.
she's just looking for some tips on how to neatly sew up her sweaters and her garments.
Well, I think it kind of depends on what the patterning is in the actual project.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that I've heard people tell people that I don't want to say that anything in knitting is wrong. If you
Mm-hmm.
like the way it turned out, you're good. But a thing that I think can make it more difficult is people will do slip stitches on the edges of their work, like when they're knitting like the back of a sweater. And when you go to seam that to the front of your sweater, you're going to end up with some holy, not necessarily goodness, not holy,
Mm-hmm.
holy, not goodness. Um, what I always do is I make sure that the first and last stitch of any piece of knitting that's going to be seamed is a stockinette stitch. So it's knit on the right side and it's purl on the wrong side. So if I have decreases, like if you're shaping the waist of something, that's a lot of waist shaping. If you're shaping the waist of something, you never want to do the decrease or like the knit two together right at the beginning of the row because that's going to be difficult to seam. You want to knit one and then do your decrease and then continue down. And then when you get to the end of that row, let's say we had a slip slip knit at the end of the row to do the decreasing, you would want to slip slip knit and then knit one. And it would be the same with increasing or any kind of crazy pattern. I could have crazy lace or garter stitch or cables or whatever all over my piece for my sweater, but I would always want that first and last stitch to be in stockinette so that they can fold over and I can easily find the places to do the mattress stitch. And I know we have videos on mattress stitch, but having that stitch be a stockinette stitch is really what you need to do. And even if I have a piece that's in garter stitch, I don't like to seam garter stitch.
Mm-hmm.
I'll always just do it in stockinette because it's easy to line up and it makes it neat and tidy.
Yeah, that's great tips there. And yeah, like Karina said, we do have some videos on mattress stitch and some other different seaming techniques. And we also have some videos just talking about the different like selvage edges, like where she's saying doing the one stockinette stitch. We actually do have a video that compares different edges. So I'm like Karina too. I do like the stockinette stitch when I'm gonna have to seam something up. And I mean, I don't know. I'm somebody where seaming is not something that comes naturally to me in knitting. And so it's one of those things, if it doesn't look good, I take it back out and start over. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
at least for the most part, they're pretty easy to take apart and put back together. Carly has a question for both of us. They would like to know if either of us have learned any new skills lately that we could share. Have you learned any new knitting things lately, Karina?
Hmm.
It's kind of hard as a designer sometimes. You don't have the time to put in to maybe learn something. I have one. How about I share mine and then you can think about if you have one.
I'm
Okay.
thinking.
So, in the process of working on the videos for the knitting circle, part of the great part about it was that I got to watch a lot of videos from our different instructors. And so Michelle Lee Bernstein did a video on doing log cabin squares, which is something like I thought about probably a few years ago, but something I hadn't really ever knit. Like, I think they look so cool. And
Mm-hmm.
so after I had watched her video, I ended up that night sitting down and just knitting a log cabin square because I was like, this looks too cool for me to have never done it before. And so that was something new that I learned. And now I've been thinking about all my various sock yarn leftovers and how I think I'm going to have to make one of those log cabin square knitted blankets because they're just so beautiful. So
Yeah,
that's a new thing I've learned lately.
they really are. I don't know if I've learned any new knitting skills lately. Because I knit for a living, quote
Mm-hmm.
unquote, I try to do other crafts for, kind of
Mm-hmm.
there's only one, I guess, one big thing that I would say that I've never done in knitting though, and that's steeking. And that's where you have color work where you're working the fair isle or the
Mm-hmm.
color stranded knitting and you set it up so that you can cut your knitting,
Mm-hmm.
and that terrifies me.
Yes.
I so I've never tried that, And it's one of those things where I'm like, okay, we're going to have to do that, Karina. We're going to have to. And so that's one of the things that's on my list. But I
Yeah.
can't say that I can think of anything new. I feel
Yeah.
like I've been baking the whole time we've been in
For the
pandemic.
last year, you've just been, yes, your Instagram has had quite a bit of bread on it.
There has been a lot
There
of
is,
bread,
there's
a lot
been
of,
some
yeah.
bread.
But
Yeah.
that's kind of what I do to decompress is
Yeah.
I try to do, that and other crafts. But steaking is definitely like on my list that I
Yeah.
really want to learn to do.
Me too. I actually started a sweater. It's somebody else's pattern, not one that I designed. And I mean, I don't know. Talk about just taking a pattern and then just doing whatever I want with it. So it was it's a top down um, sweater, like pullover. And it's color work. It's Fair Isle. And I was like, I really want to make this into a cardigan. And I've never steeked anything like Karina said, like where you cut it and then pick up. And I'm just like, yeah, I'm just doing this. So I've started my cardigan. I'm not very far yet, but I've got those stitches in there. And I guess when I'm done, I'm going to just try to cut the entire sweater down the front and turn it into a cardigan. I guess we'll see. But
I have a friend that's having a baby in the fall, and I'm like, oh, that would be a good little project to do to
Mhm.
like practice my steeking and make
Mhm.
something, I don't know, with like duckies or something
Yeah. Oh,
adorable,
that'd be so cute.
right?
Okay. Maybe we just need to make a video of you and me trying to speak. Like, we've never done this before. We're just going to try, see what
There
happens.
you go. There you go. Can there
Yeah.
be wine with the video?
I don't know if it, maybe.
That's probably a very bad idea,
Yeah, I
actually.
don't know. Maybe it will help. Maybe it won't. Allison would like to know about how to fix holes in her knitting. So I think like maybe as they're knitting along, maybe they're noticing a hole where there shouldn't be a hole. So I don't know. That might be an issue of like again maybe bringing the yarn over the needle as you're working. What do you think?
Yeah, that definitely is. And if you've gone and you've, fixed if that's messed up anything in your thing, like sometimes the yarn over will add and then you'll be like, oh, I have too many stitches and
Mm-hmm.
you decrease away. And personally, I say go for it because I am not a fan of ripping things out.
Yeah, no.
But my go-to for that, like a small hole, is just to cut a length of yarn that's maybe 12 inches long, weave it in, cinch it up, and then weave the ends on the back on the wrong side in opposite directions so that they cinch that closed. I mean, if it's something that's, not going to make a huge deal, I just do that.
Yeah.
And I've done that a lot of times because it's like, oh, where did this come from? Oh, well, everything else is fine. So just grab a
Yeah.
length of yarn and you can just kind of tie it and you can kind of see, is it tight enough? Do I need to cinch it up more or less? And then make sure the fabric looks good. And then kind of go. The only thing, that you want to make sure of is that you haven't dropped a stitch.
Mm-hmm.
That's a whole nother animal. But if it's a hole that's, not going anywhere, not going to run away from you, then I would just add a length of yarn and close it
Yeah.
up.
Same. I was going to say the same thing. Like if I'm one or two rows away from that hole, I might go back and fix it if it's something small. If it's a whole sweater,
Right.
no, I'm probably doing exactly what Karina said and adding that length of yarn. I also took a class years ago about Estonian lace, and it's kind of like almost the opposite of what you're saying, where the instructor was saying if she forgot a yarn over, she would actually take yarn and like sew a hole open on purpose where she should have had a yarn over, which I've never actually tried to do.
Wow.
But I know that I thought that was impressive. So yeah, it
That's
could
kind
work
of
both
like,
ways. You could use the yarn to close the hole or make a new hole where you forgot to put one. Let's see. We have another question from Carly. What has been your most fun project that you've made? I'm looking for a project to spice up my routine. Oh my gosh, I've made so many different projects. I don't even know. I think for me, I knit a sweater a couple years ago. It's called the Comfort Fade Cardi. You can find it online. It's available on the internet to buy. And you use four different colors of yarn and you kind of stripe it in a way where the colors fade into each other. And it's actually a very simple cardigan pattern. It's worked in reverse stockinette. So basically you're still knitting and purling, but the purls are on the right side and the knit stitches are on the wrong side.
mm,
And that for me, it was super fun to make. And also it's probably the knitted thing that I've made that I actually wear the most. So for me, it was that. And that one, I would say if you're an adventurous beginner, you could probably handle that one, that
Oh,
pattern.
hmm,
Yeah.
yeah, patterns like that are good. I
Hmm.
love the adventurous beginner thing. That's like my
Hmm.
favorite kind of knitter.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
you've learned your knits and your pearls and your basic,
Hmm.
and what do you want to try? I think for me, the things that I have the most fun with are slip stitch work. I love slip stitch work. And I particularly, there's so many beautiful yarns that are crazy colors. And I love doing a crazy color with a solid color and kind of making the slip stitch stuff. I'm trying to think of a project that I've done recently that I've done that with. But I really, really like doing slip stitches with crazy colors and then like
Hmm.
one solid color. And I think there's
Yeah.
so many pretty projects you can do in that vein.
What about like you have that pattern that's on our website, the Nepeta hat and cowl? Those I think
Yes,
what that might those patterns might look good if you used one crazy color and one solid color. You used two solid colors, but
I did. You know what else would be really pretty in crazy colors and a solid color would be the Bialise shawl. And
hmm.
that's the one where you do a ruffle and then you pick up stitches and you do a slip stitch pattern kind of in striped bands. So that would be really pretty if you
Yeah.
did a solid color and a semi solid because you kind of switch the roles of the colors as you change the rows.
Hmm.
So,
Now I'm going to get off this with you and then want to start doing some slip stitch color work. I really like the idea of using one super variegated yarn and one solid. I love doing that kind of stuff with any, not even just slip stitch color work, just stripes, even
oh
some
yeah.
lace patterns. It's kind of fun to combine the two together. So let's see. I'm not seeing any more questions over here, but I have a couple more questions for you.
Okay.
Um, so we kind of been talking about different techniques that we like. Do you have one favorite technique, or do you have like one favorite thing that you like to design in general?
That's interesting.
I don't know.
I'm a slow knitter. Like
Hmm.
people who know me and who have sat with me, like when I'm knitting, they'll be, I can't believe you do this for a living. They make fun of me and it's fine. I can take it.
Hmm.
But I'm a slow knitter. So I love to design sweaters. I love,
Hmm.
love, love to design sweaters. And I love to design sweaters that have interesting constructions. But I'm so slow. I run out of steam for knitting the sweaters. Fortunately, there are sample knitters in the world who are fast and efficient and wonderful people that I hire to do the sweaters. I think I only knit one sweater out of my latest book.
Hmm.
Um, Maybe two, I'm not sure. But I really love to design sweaters and I like to think about different ways that you can create the fabric that really makes the yarn do pretty things. So I've been thinking about a lot of diagonal and interesting construction. So I think
Hmm.
for me, that's it, is things that really, I mean, there's so many beautiful yarns. You know, it used to be yarns were just, you have a red yarn or a blue yarn, and now you have a rainbow yarn with speckles and whatever. And so I really like doing things that make the yarn kind of sing,
Yeah, I agree. I don't know. Yeah, lately I feel like the yarn, speaks to me almost first, and then I figure out what it's going to become. There's
right?
so many options now. Oh my gosh. I remember when I first started knitting and I seriously thought everybody just bought their yarn at the big box craft store, which is a great place to get yarn. They have very nice yarns there and it's very affordable. But then slowly you slowly start opening the whole world of all the yarns and
So
gosh, you
many
can get
pretty things.
so many pretty things. We have a question here from Kelly. How should I wash my finished products for the first time? I have a pair of red mittens that I'm nervous about because they're my first usable project.
I guess the first question I would ask is there any other color but red?
Right, yeah.
Um,
That would be my question too.
if it's more than one color with the red, then what I would do is I would take some of the leftover yarn and I would knit up a little bit of stripes, just simple stripes, doesn't have to be anything fancy, with, for example, the red and the other color, because you want to know if the red is going to bleed onto another color.
Mhm.
Now, that aside, normally what I do when I'm washing projects and going to block them or soak them, I like one of the wool washes. There's a variety of brands out there that are available. They always smell nice. I mean, you can get unscented ones if that's not your thing, but they have like all these beautiful orange. I love citrus smells, but I
Mm-hmm.
use a wool wash and I soak my stuff in not hot water. I soak it in like a warm water. I have giant bowls in my house that only make bread and soak sweaters. And so I soak it. I've always been told to soak anything for at least a half an hour because it allows the fibers to be fully saturated. So you want to make sure it's completely covered and totally saturated. And then depending on the size of the object, if it's small, I can just squeeze it out with my hands and then do whatever blocking or smoothing it out on a towel to let it dry. If it's a large object, I like to get it into a towel and squeeze it. But for the red, you just want to be careful if it's going to bleed onto other colors. But to do a little sample of that, I'll let you know. But for the most part, even colors like red that let some color out, it shouldn't be enough that it'll affect the color, the final color of your project. Red has a tendency to bleed. It's
Yeah.
just one of those colors, no matter how good the dyer is. But just I would soak it in a warm wool wash, carefully squeeze all the water out, and then lay it out to dry. And probably with mitts, you probably don't need to like be crazy with the blocking. You can probably just smooth it out.
Mm-hmm.
But if there's a pattern that you want to stretch out, you could use some pens and stretch it out as
Mm-hmm.
well. And then just let it air dry. I never, ever, ever put my hand knits in the wash. Even if it says superwash, even it says whatever. Now, I've never had to deal with knits in a baby, but I never put my hand knits in the wash. I always hand wash them and let them air dry.
Yeah, just hitting on exactly what you said, especially with the red. A lot of yarns do bleed. The red does bleed, so don't throw it in with your white socks into the washing machine. And also, you can also check what the yarn label says, depending on, especially if it's like a commercial yarn you bought at a craft store. It's more like mass manufactured yarn. A lot of times they will have the washing instructions right on the yarn
Oh, yeah.
label. Yeah,
Hmm.
and so it might tell you can throw it in the washing machine. Now I do sometimes throw my knitting into the washing machine. Actually, even my hand knit socks that are made out of like superwash wool, those babies go in the washer and the dryer.
Okay, you're brave with
So
that.
I'm
But
very brave. I'm not saying to do that, but yeah, check your yarn label, and yeah, otherwise just hand wash it by itself, just to make sure. Because I've been surprised even sometimes yarns that I don't think that any color is going to come off, even like acrylic yarns. If I have decided to hand wash it, I've been surprised. Sometimes the color, like again, it doesn't affect the color of the finished item, but your water's going to turn that color. So you just
mhm.
want to be a little bit careful there. Um, yeah, it's fully okay. Yes, Kelly says that her project is all red. So yes, you don't have
Oh,
to worry about
good.
it like bleeding onto the white. I did knit a shawl. I did knit a shawl once that had red yarn and then had like a variegated like white, gray, and red together.
Mhm.
And I didn't, it was like very like room temperature water, and the red did get right onto that, right onto the white part of the yarn, and it doesn't take much for the red to bleed onto the other colors. Let's see. Millie would like to know about the shawl that is draped behind you on your dress form.
The shawl it's always like the latest thing that I finished.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so this is a new shawl that's going to come out. Oh gosh, I don't think until April actually. It's going to
Mm-hmm.
be a part of a collection.
Oh, nice.
Um, so it is just it's a silk wool single, and then it's asymmetrical, and it's got a little fringe on it. But if you keep track of me online, you'll see when it comes out. I think I'm trying to remember what I named it. I wanted to name it Neapolitan because it feels like
Mm-hmm.
chocolate and strawberry and vanilla ice cream to me. That's what I called it the whole time I was working on it. But I think I called it something French that was like Neapolitan.
Yeah.
But if you pay attention, you'll see pictures. But yeah, it's always whatever I just worked on is on the mannequin
Yeah.
because I can't have models right now to take pictures.
Yeah, I know.
So,
Yeah, it's hard right now.
and the only
Um,
person I have at home is my adult son, and he's not super keen on modeling knitwear for
Yeah,
me.
understandable, I guess. Yeah. Oh, going back to our discussion about the red yarns and washing our projects, Susan would like to know if you could use a color catcher in the water when you soak it. I actually have done this before. I don't know. It could be risky, but I have done it. I have done it on a red project.
I would I would test it. If
Yeah.
you're putting it in the washing machine and you're going to use a color catcher, I would be worried about, turning undies pink and all of that.
Hmm.
But like I said, I would probably I don't know how expensive color catchers are. I've never used them. But if you could like
Yeah.
test like a swatch of it before you do it is what I would do if at all possible. Just
Yeah.
because you just never know, how these bright colors are going to behave. And a lot of times, sometimes you will have worked with it before and you know that it's not going to do anything.
Hmm.
But yeah, I would test a small piece of it before I would jeopardize my whites or my larger knitted object.
Yeah.
So,
I have when I've been like hand washing a new project that I was going to block if it was red or something. I have put one of those color catcher sheets into the water before, and I haven't had any problem. I guess I don't know. I guess like one thing you have to think about is the color catcher probably sheet probably does have some kind of like chemicals in it or something, and I guess you
mhm.
don't 100% sure know how that might react with your yarn. But I just kind of I tend to just go for it. So I just threw the color catcher in there. It was surprising that it didn't pick up all of the color that came out in the water like when I did it for a red project, but the color sheet did catch some of it. So that could help too. Oh yeah, and Susan says that they're cheap and she
Oh,
uses them when she washes her quilts. So yeah, I mean you could try that too. That definitely could
yeah, I
work.
would test it then. Yeah,
Yeah.
to see how it did.
Right. I mean, like I said, I'm also throwing my socks in the dryer, so.
Well, I live in Florida, so I don't
Yeah.
knit
Yeah,
socks.
you don't need
So,
socks. Yeah. I'm in Illinois. I need the socks.
yes, you do. Yes, you
Yeah.
do.
Oh yeah, a box of 20 color catchers is $3 or $4. So yeah,
Oh,
very
oh, yeah.
very
If it's a cheap
inexpensive.
thing, yeah.
Yeah, very cheap. Let's see. I would like to know what kind of knitting needles do you like best? Like, do you like circulars, metal? What type of knitting needles do you like to use?
I always use circulars. I'm just
Hmm.
knitting a gauge swatch
Hmm.
for a new project for the knitting circle.
Hmm.
But I always use circulars. I do not like straights. The only time I use straights is when I do videos. And the reason I use straights when I do videos is because I don't know if you can hear it, but the cords and the circulars tend to make noise when
Hmm.
they hit the my surface, my table or whatever. But I use circulars almost exclusively. I have a fair few fixed circulars, but my favorite are the interchangeables because I was doing a hat the other day and I didn't have DPNs to finish off the top of my hat. So I just took my interchangeables that were on a short cord for my hat and I changed them out to a long cord so I could magic loop up the top of the hat. And then I do a lot of shawls. Jen and I both design tons of shawls. And I don't like a super long circular needle when I first start the shawl. But if I'm on interchangeables, I can easily just switch to a longer cord as the shawl gets bigger
Hmm.
and the stitches increase. Um, I'm super picky. I only use, one kind of needle. I like the carbon fiber needles. Jen made me try some metal needles once, and I started using those, and it made me angry because I don't have time for that. But the thing that you do have to keep in mind when you're thinking about needles is that your wooden needles and your metal needles might not get you the same gauge. So if you're switching needles in a project, you need to make sure of that. But I have one kind of needle, and that's pretty much what I use exclusively. These are giant needles. I don't have a ton of giant needles. It's like as
Yeah.
big as my pinky finger.
Hmm.
So these are woodens that are a fixed length, but I always use circulars. And also, if you're doing a large project, a shawl or a sweater or a blanket, it takes the weight off of your elbows, off of your arms, and it's actually ergonomically better for you than straights. You can get a lot of weight on long straight needles. That's not good for you long term if you knit all the time like a crazy person like Jen and I do.
Hmm. Yep. Yeah, same. I just use one kind of like you kind of do over time. It's like anything. You find that brand that you like or that type of needle that you like, and you just
Hmm.
kind of stick with that. Like I seriously, again, because this is our job, we probably do have maybe more knitting needles than most. I mean, I probably have 10 like size 5 32-inch circulars that are the same brand because
Right.
depending on what I'm working on, I could have things going on almost all of those needles. So we have time for just a few more questions. So if you're just joining us, just to remind you, you can leave questions in the chat box or in the comments, depending on where you're watching it. And also, don't forget that you can download our free pattern today, which is the Chunky Broken Rib Cowl, which is one of our cute, easy patterns that we have on the knitting circles. So I'm going to go ahead and throw you a few more questions here, Karina. So let's see. Somebody asked what a color catcher is. So it's just like it kind of looks like a dryer sheet. It's just like kind of this fabricy piece of like paper, like a dryer sheet, but a little bit thicker, and you could throw it into your laundry. And so if you have like new clothes that are going to run, like you got that new red shirt you love, you could throw it in there, and it will catch the color, opposed to your socks or whatever catching the color. Um, so yeah, and you can just find them like at the grocery store and in the
Okay.
laundry aisle. Let's see, and then let's see. Okay, Kelly says, I've seen on YouTube people knitting on a circular needle and then they switch to a thinner needle and then a thicker needle. What effect would this make? So I wonder if maybe if they're on circular needles, maybe they're changing needle sizes. I don't know if that means that they're using one in one hand, one in the other, or what, but
Um, I've not used that myself. I've seen some people because how big around your needle is how big your stitches are.
mm-hmm.
Um, I've seen some people do that for if they're doing something where they want a different effect. For example, they'll do a few rows in a size 10 and it'll be very airy and open. And then they'll do a bunch of stitches in a size 6. And then the fabric will get dense and it kind of gives like is it ruching or ruching? I never know how to say that word.
I
Ruching?
say ruching. I say
Ruching,
ruching.
like
Never
a
mind.
ruffly effect because the width of the fabric and how the fabric is will change.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be a reason you'll do that. Um, I've also heard there's a lady that I know that would do that sometimes because there wasn't a size. When you go from a size 10 and a half, 10 and a half is a 6.5 millimeters needle, and you go to an 11 and it's an 8 millimeter needle. Like, so there's like a huge jump. So she would use a 10 and a half and an 11 because she said it made her a fabric that was in between,
Okay.
which was a little crazy to me, but it
Yeah.
seemed to work. So that might be another reason that they do it. But in general, of course, you want to make sure your needles are the same size. I keep a needle gauge attached to the box that holds all my needles so that
Mm-hmm.
when I'm pulling needles out of their labeled boxes, I can actually stick them in the gauge just to make sure that I haven't you know, misfiled them. I have a crazy filing system for my needles, but I have a needle gauge that tells me, this is definitely a size, whatever it needs to be for my project,
Mm-hmm.
so I don't do something wonky.
Yeah. And the only other place I could think like what you said was right about different times you would use different needles is that sometimes when people are binding off their knitting, they might use a larger
Oh,
needle in their one
mhm.
hand, um, to bind off with a larger needle so that their bind off is more loose, especially if they're going to block it like for a shawl. But yeah, most of
Absolutely.
the time you want the needles to be the same size as you're knitting. And then like you might have to go up, like Karina was saying, like maybe depending on your fabric or the design element, you might have your needles on one size needle and then start knitting with the next size needle and switch back and forth that way.
I've actually seen a sweater pattern that did that. Actually, it was a yarn, it was an open airy pattern, obviously, but they
Mm-hmm.
started with the smaller needles at the bust and they were doing an A line. So they kept increasing the needle sizes as they went down the body to make the fabric bigger and bigger. So it kind of made a natural A line and then
Oh,
it
that's
made the
interesting.
fabric more sheer and more open as they got to the bottom.
Oh, that's kind of neat. That would be something
Yeah.
cool to experiment with. Cool. Let's see. Let's see. Paula would like to know, well, she's having a hard time finding a size 6 36-inch long circular knitting needles. Any suggestions on where to buy? I don't, can you get a 36? I thought it was 30. Maybe you can.
I have
32 and then 40, I
not
thought.
seen 36s
Yeah.
for a very long time.
Hmm.
I know they used to have them. I want to say they used to have them, and then companies just, for cost reasons, probably got more in the habit of going from a 32 to a 40. So,
Hmm.
like you see in the 8-inch increments, you get a 16, a 24, a 32, a 40. You do see a lot of 20s nowadays. I have a giant head. It doesn't look like it, but I do. And so I use a 20-inch circular needle when I'm making my own hats because 16, I mean, I've got, 23 inches ahead here, so it's easier for me to have the bigger needle. The thing to keep in mind when you're looking at circular needles is just to make sure that whatever circular needle you're using is a good bit smaller. So if you were making a 36-inch sweater, for example, you wouldn't want a 36-inch needle, but it would be helpful for like, a 38 or a 40-inch sweater.
Hmm.
But I can't say that I've seen those in recent years.
Yeah,
The
yeah, I don't
8-inch
think
jumps are
so.
very common.
Yeah, I agree. You might be able sometimes with, well, I still don't know if you could even make a 36 with like with the interchangeable, sometimes they have that little thing that comes in between so you can join cords together. So I guess it could be possible that you could make a 36-inch out of a
Mhm.
out of a
16 and a 20?
yeah, I mean, yeah, if you could find those. But yeah, I think you probably would just have to get either a 32 or a 40 like
Yeah,
Karina said.
unfortunately.
Let's see. Well, since we're talking about circular needles, I'm gonna stick with the circular needle question. So Susan wants to know. So you can make anything with a circular needle?
Yes.
Yeah.
Like right now, like I said, I'm knitting a swatch because I'm gonna check the gauge on this before I do the project. So I'm just knitting back and forth. So basically, it's just the same as when you're knitting flat. It's just I'll knit across this row, and then when I get to the end, I flip it over and do the next thing. So anything that you can do with straights, you can do with circulars.
Hmm.
Um, the vice versa doesn't work, obviously, because you can't really knit in the round with straight needles.
Hmm.
A lot of things you can knit on straight needles and seam them up. Like there are hats that'll have a seam up the back instead of knitting them in the round. I just, if I had to recommend for people what kind of needles to buy, I would always tell them to buy the circulars
Right.
because there's things that you can do with the circulars that you can't do with the straights.
Right. You can just do everything you need to do for knitting, basically. For the like, pretty much, you can just do it with the circular needle.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and I do think that I don't know. I think a lot of people do start out. A lot of people do start out maybe with the straight needles because that's what
Mm-hmm.
you think of when you think of knitting. Is you just like think of the two straight knitting needles. But for a lot of people, as they like continue on their knitting journey and they start knitting things that are bigger,
Right.
um, most people do end up switching to just making everything on the circular needle. Like they find again that one sort of brand or type of needle that they like, and then they just stick with that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. So, oh, we have some yarn related questions. So let's get to those. Um, Rebecca would like to know, living in Florida, Karina, what is your favorite fiber to use, like for personal use? Like if you were knitting yourself a sweater, what do you want that sweater made out of?
I'm actually working on when I in my free time. I laugh because I'm super busy with stuff. But in my free time, I'm actually working on a sweater design for myself. And I don't knit a lot of sweaters for myself because it's I think it's going to be 90 here today. But I have a it's a wool nettle blend,
Mhm.
and it's not something that you would think about, but the nettle is just a beautiful, like breathable fabric. And basically, for me, for Florida, I make sweaters for air conditioning problems. So, we have a bit of a winter here, but not a ton. But basically, it's cardigans that I can wear and take off if it's cool in a building and stuff. So the nettle wool blend is wonderful for lightweight pieces like that. I tend to do a lot of thinner yarns. I recommend people use thinner yarns. I wrote a book about knitting for warmer climates where everything was DK or lighter. There was nothing bulky or anything in there. So definitely, there's more knitting involved in a fingering weight sweater, but it's definitely going to be lighter and more wearable. The other thing that I'm actually got rolling around in my head is I've done some work with some linen blends, and the linen blends aren't super fun on your hands sometimes because they're a little scratchy, so you need a lot of hand lotion.
Mm-hmm.
But the linen, of course, gets softer as you wash it, and so that's perfect for like tanks and lightweight sweaters
Mm-hmm.
for the Florida weather. But yeah, it's definitely really. I like the nettle and I like the linen.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like cotton for Florida. Cotton shirts and stuff are fine, but when you're knitting with cotton, it tends to be rather heavy,
Mm-hmm.
and I've not found that very conducive to our weather down here. So
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I feel like even me being in Illinois, I do need the warm clothes in the wintertime, but I have been very into like non-wool things lately. I'm very into like bamboo silk blends and stuff. I actually
mhm.
get kind of itchy wearing like a lot of wool. So I've been like kind of experimenting with sort of some of those yarns that you think about for more warm weather climates because
Mhm.
they're so pretty and they're so fun to work with. Oh my gosh, I'm like obsessed with
Well,
like
and they're
bamboo
next to the
silk.
skin soft too, which is
Hmm.
nice.
Yeah. Yes, they are. All right. I think we have time for just a couple more questions. Kimber would like to know if you have a yarn that has haunted you, like no matter what, no pattern has worked. Is there a yarn that's haunting your dreams, Karina?
I don't know if there's a yarn,
Hmm.
but there is a pattern.
Hmm.
Back in the day, like there was like a huge knitting like renaissance resurgence like in 2004, and that was when we moved here, and then I started to learn to knit, and there were yarn stores everywhere, and there was this sock pattern called the Jaywalker.
Oh, I made one. I made
Did
those.
you?
Hmm.
I made those socks. I tried to make those socks so many times. And I'm a tall woman. I'm not a petite woman. I have size 10 feet. And I read all the things and I understood things already. I knit those socks so many dang times. I could never get them to fit. And if you're not familiar, the Jaywalker socks have a very deep chevron pattern,
Hmm.
which is really great for variegated yarns because it makes them beautiful, and it also makes them a little bit tighter. No matter what cast on I used, no matter what yarn I used, I tried different yarn, I tried different needles, I tried different cast on numbers. I could not make a pair of Jaywalkers to fit my feet to save my life. I made things, for clown shoes, I made things for toddlers. I never made a thing
Hmm.
that would fit a normal human being. And eventually I gave up. And it's
Hmm.
just one of those things that it's like, one of these days I'm going to make some Jaywalkers. And it's like, no, you're not. Just it'll just give you gas and make you cranky. So
Maybe we should revisit. I mean, I have no idea what happened to that pair of socks. I'm assuming that mine got a hole in it, and like I might darn a pair of socks now, but back when I first started knitting, I definitely would just get rid of them. But maybe we should revisit that pattern. That was right around when I started knitting too, and first learned to knit socks. That pattern was very popular.
and there
All
were
right,
so many knitting blogs and everybody was
so
knitting them and I couldn't get them
yeah,
to work. I was so
everybody was
frustrated.
knitting them on all the knitting blogs, and that's like so
Yes.
I had to make them too. Same. That's so funny. Yeah, because we didn't even know each other way back then.
No, we didn't.
Um, okay, so I think I'm going to end it with this final question, which was on my list to ask you. Well, this question is actually for both of us, but I'll let you answer it first. Where can we find you online, and where can we find your patterns?
I have a ton of patterns on the Knitting Circle, actually. Some of the
Mm-hmm.
ones that we talked about, and I'm working on some new ones for the Knitting Circle.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a ton of patterns on the Knitting Circle, which is great. And then I have kind of my personal stuff. My business name is Craft Star Studios.
Mm-hmm.
So you can find me on Instagram. I have a website by the same name, and I've been working on getting all of my patterns up on a separate site so that people can get them. They're currently on Ravelry and Lovecrafts as well, so they're kind of everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But probably the easiest place to connect is Instagram, because then you
Mm-hmm.
can see what I'm working on, and like things like this I'll announce when they're available, or like I did a bunch of things today to announce, hey, I'm going to be live, and if you want to see my crazy face and that
Mm-hmm.
thing. But yeah, Craft Star Studios is my knitting business name.
Great. Yeah, same for me. You can find a lot of my patterns on the Knitting Circle. And obviously, we both have a lot of video content on the Knitting Circle. You can find me on Instagram as Jen Lucas Designs, and I post whatever knitting and crochet thing I'm working on there. So we're kind of coming to the end of our time here. So thanks so much for joining us, Karina. Do you have any final words for our viewers?
I really think the big thing is that everything is just knits and pearls. So don't be afraid to try fun new things. There's tons of video content on our site that'll help you with the tricky bits, but just knits and pearls. Learn to knit and purl, and you can do it all.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. Thanks, Karina, for joining me today. And I want to thank all of you viewers for joining us for our live Q&A. We'll be back again next month for another one. We will have another knitting instructor from the Knitting Circle chatting and answering your questions. Don't forget, if you haven't already, you can download the chunky broken rib cowl pattern that we have available for you today. You can find the link in the comments or on the page where you're watching this. And thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you again soon. I'm Jen Lucas. Take care.